Hello, it's Mirta here, and today's subject of the day is going to be PTSD.
So now is probably when you're asking yourself, well, what is PTSD? PTSD is an abbreviation for post-traumatic stress disorder. Post-traumatic stress disorder is a mental health condition that is triggered by terrifying events that a person has either experienced or witnessed in their lifetime. Okay, now we're going to get into the symptoms someone with post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD for short, can have. With the first on our list being intrusive memories. So this is when the person who is suffering with this disorder has recurrent memories of the traumatic event and that they are unwanted. They don't want to think about these events, it just comes up. Second on the list of possible symptoms are nightmares. The person with this disorder could have nightmares about the traumatic event that is causing them this pain. Another major symptom of this disorder is avoidance, in which the person tries not to think of the traumatic event or even talk about the event. Next symptom for PTSD would be a negative change in thinking. So they start to feel negatively about themselves, or they start feeling guilty about what happened in the traumatic event that they experienced. Another symptom would be them experiencing a physical and emotional change within themselves, such as being always on guard, easily being startled, having trouble sleeping, and having angry outbursts out of nowhere. More symptoms would be memory problems, lack of interest in activities, and distancing themselves from friends or family. Now we're going to look at causes of PTSD. These are just more of the main categories in which people fall into when they've experienced a traumatic event and suffer from PTSD afterwards. That's not to say that these are the only main 3 reasons or causes people get PTSD. And these 3 are someone who has been in the war, someone who's experienced a serious accident, or someone who has suffered from physical or sexual assault at the hands of another. Okay, so now when it comes to PTSD, there are possible treatments for it, but they mainly go into 2 different categories, and that's psychological therapies or medication. So we're first going to start off with the different type of psychological therapy someone can go through to help them cope with PTSD. The first type of psychological therapy is cognitive behavioral therapy. And this is targeted at getting the person suffering with PTSD the help they need to manage their problems by trying to change how they think and act. An example would be the therapist asking them to confront their traumatic memories by thinking of the experience in detail. As this is happening, they're trying to help the person cope with any distress they feel while helping them notice any unhelpful thoughts or misrepresentations of the experience. The next type of psychological therapy is eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. Sorry if I butchered that, I tried my best. This is when a person has to move their eyes in a side-to-side movement while recalling the traumatic event. Last one is group therapy, and this has been helpful for people to talk about their experiences with others and kind of learn how to manage their symptoms and understand the condition that they have. As I mentioned earlier, there is the possible treatment with medication for someone suffering with PTSD. So we're going to get into the treatment of World War II veterans. I hesitated for a moment there. I couldn't think of the word and I put in, but I mean of, the treatment of World War II veterans. So when looking at some of the more common symptoms the men during that time suffered with were night terrors, a few more symptoms being that they were drinking heavily, they suffered from survivor's guilt, less common symptom of someone during this time was to have depression. Now, all of these symptoms were symptoms of someone suffering with PTSD. However, with not that much information on it during the time, the people suffering with this disorder were more commonly known to have had shell shock. Now we're going to move on to the treatment of veterans from the Vietnam War. As I mentioned earlier, there wasn't that much information about PTSD or shell shock at the time. However, after the Vietnam War and the Vietnam veterans got back, the term PTSD was used for their disorder instead of the term shell shock or any other term used at the time for someone suffering with this disorder. Now we're going to move on to access to the treatments like I mentioned earlier. Now, when looking at access to treatment, the only real main access I found was specifically for veterans. And this was for them to go through the Department of Veterans Affairs Healthcare Center. And the only real problem I could see with someone not being able to get this access who is a veteran would be if they were homeless and had no way of contacting them via phone or internet, because they obviously most likely would not have any sort of technology to be able to contact them. So since in the first chapter we know it's coming from Kurt Vonnegut's perspective, I chose to use this first example as from page 12 when he was referring the capes in the Hudson River to being as big as atomic submarines. I do want to note that this isn't the only example, but is one that stuck out in my mind because we know the first chapter specifically was written by Kurt Vonnegut, as in his perspective, and not necessarily the character Billy's perspective. However, there are many more examples within the novel of Billy's PTSD coming up and his whole situation with being unstuck in time and just going back and forth between different memories and everything. Now we're at the end of the video and I'm just putting in my works cited here. I hope you enjoyed and have learned something from this video.